which talks about the character, at least in terms of some scientific ways that they think. But we need to start, as psychologists, need to start looking at the personality, just as we look at the personality of African Americans. So it's time for researchers to begin a systematic study of the character of those people who rape the world, define nearly 90% of the world as less than human, because they're making up less than 15% of the world's population. We must seek to understand those people who would divide the continent of Africa among themselves, colonize its people, confiscate all of its natural resources, slaughter millions of Africans in the name of white supremacy, and say that we ought to be happy. We will continue to miss the humanity and the alternative value system established by African Americans if we do not systematically study those who have oppressed the world. And as soon as you start systematically studying them, you will lose your jobs. So you must be prepared for that. You will be attacked. You must be prepared for that. It was Malcolm X's keen analysis of white America that frightened them and so revered him to African Americans. As social scientists, we have not done what Malcolm did. We have been afraid to adventure beyond the narrow confines of Western morality. We have nearly always studied the oppressed because our training tells us the oppressed is sick and need to be analyzed in order to make them whole. That's where we are right now today, as they're coming in with all of these things about our children. Your comments were so well taken today, Brother Oscar. Come in with all of these things. Rather than to study the oppressor and the systems that they have designed to keep us in certain kinds of positions. And further, we worry about who will publish our research findings if we study white America. Who would hire us? Who will give us tenure? And as we approach the 21st century, we, the descendants of millions of Africans who sacrificed for us to be here, must step beyond the narrow confines of Western science and thought. We must establish research agendas that liberate the lives of African people worldwide. And those of us in the United States know the Western culture better than any other African. We have lived with them, raised their children, cleaned their house, bore their children who they have abandoned. The research questions that we raise must go beyond the alleged low self-esteem, self-hatred of black people. We must begin to look at the vast majority of Africans in the diaspora who have managed to hold on to their core culture, who manage their lives without much fanfare, who continue to create the only, quote, true American culture, although they are never given credit for doing so. And that is, whatever you think is American, we must look to African Americans for its authenticity. We must look at the spiritual, look at the blues, look at jazz, look at rap, look at Martin dance, look at tap dance, look at the Charleston, the cakewalk, jitterbug, hustler, electric slide, whatever. We must raise research questions that begin to explain how an oppressed people can raise in its midst of oppression a David Walker, an Anna Julia Cooper, a Henry Highland Garnett, a Harriet Tubman, a Booker T. Washington, a Ida B. Wells Barnett, a Denmark Vesey, a Mary Church Terrell, a Martin Delaney, a W.B. Du Bois, a Mary McLeod Bethune, a Paul Robeson, a Fannie Lou Hamer, or a Marcus Garvey. These individuals are no accidents. They grew up and out of an African core. They were endowed with a character and a personality by their parents, by relatives and friends, living in the most devastating conditions. And yet, they have given the world individuals who are profound philosophical writers and impeccable in their behavior. And what is the core culture of African Americans that produce inventors like Elijah McCoy, the real McCoy, like Madam C.J. Walker, and the great athletes that go back to the first 10 original winners of the Kentucky Derby, to the boxers and the track players and the baseball players and the basketball players? What is it? And I would suggest to you that much of the answer must turn to the early socialization of African Americans. We must return to the source to fetch that which we left behind. We must reconstruct that past. We must know the values we were taught as African American children. And how do we see those values in behavior? And what must we do to re-establish those values in the lives of our children today? What modalities and paradigms grow out of the value systems of Africans living in the diaspora? And how can we take what we know from living in the belly of the beast and develop theory and research appropriate for all of Africa? So what is this foundation, this African American Culture Foundation? I suggest to you that it is based on a foundation of Kemetic values. Mayat is the foundation of both the natural and social order of ancient Kemet society. It is the spirit and the method of organizing and conducting relationships in society. Mayat is truth, it's justice, it's righteousness, which becomes real only in personal and social practice. John Blassingame, in his book on the slave community, tells us that it was the enslaved Africans who humanized the South. And I never thought about it. I never thought that when you go south, or you used to go south, everybody would speak to each other. Good morning, how you doing? He said it was the enslaved Africans who taught white people how to be polite. Even in their enslavement, they were able to do that. Taught them how to speak to each other. He said it was the enslaved Africa who slowed down the South. Slow down, boss. Don't move. Sit down. Relax. How were they able to do that? I would suggest that they were able to do that because many whites, and we haven't even looked at the implications of that, but many whites were raised, because they tell us that, were raised by black mothers. What does it mean to be nursed by a black woman? And when we read about the enslavement of Africans, we learn that African women were wet nurses. What does that mean? They're telling us today that there's a bonding that takes place. And that a baby don't know that this woman that's giving me this milk is not my mother. And so at some point there is an ad in the paper in the 19th century where this white father has taken out this ad saying we must get our children away from these Negro women because they're speaking just like them. So Blassingame said it was the enslaved Africans that gave the people in the South their dialect. How y'all doing? I mean, is there something in the air in the South that make you talk different than people in the North? They were raised by these black women. So they had many of the beliefs that these women had, because if she was going to put something around her baby's neck to ward off whatever, she'd also put it around the white baby's neck. We need to study that. E. Franklin Frazier talks about how these black women love taking care of these white babies. And we know about that. But we don't know about the consequences of these white babies being raised and